Vietnam War started in 1954. It was a prolonged struggle between the nationalist forces attempting to unify the country under the communist government led by Ho Chi Minh. The U.S. aided the nationalists and attempted to prevent the spread of communism by sending financial aid and military advisors to South Vietnam in the 1950s. As troop levels and casualties escalated throughout the 1960s, the war became increasingly unpopular at home, inciting large-scale protests, profoundly affecting popular culture, and fomenting mutual distrust between the public and its leaders. The United States began withdrawing its troops in 1973, and in 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese forces. It was estimated that more than 58,000 American soldiers had perished. And here's Amy to tell you the causes of the Vietnam War.
The primary cause of the Vietnam War was the invasion of the French shortly after World War II. By doing this, it created an imbalance in the country, and at the same time, it created an opportunity for national movements to emerge. The communist leader Ho Chi Minh demanded more self-governance and less French influences, and founded a militant nationalist organization called the Viet Minh. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam a free and independent country. However, France refused to recognize Ho's declaration and returned to Vietnam. This started the First Indochina War that lasted until 1954. This brought France to a humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu and prompted them to seek a peace settlement. The same year, the Geneva Accords officially divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel into North Vietnam under Ho and his communist forces, and South Vietnam, which was anti-communist. And the U.S. took this opportunity and proposed Diem as the new president of South Vietnam. Diem had left Vietnam earlier on during the French Indochina War for the U.S., and throughout his time there, he met influential Catholics such as JFK and told them how much he was against communism and French colonialism. This was his way of getting his foot into the door so that he would become leader of Vietnam. Eventually it worked, and Diem was sent back to the U.S. and he was elected in October of 1955 as president of South Vietnam. But once Diem was in power, he took his position very lightly and made decisions that upset the South Vietnamese people. Even the elections that were supposed to be held in an attempt to reunite the two nations in 1956 were cancelled, which created even more conflict among the people. Attempts were made to overthrow him, not only because he wasn't doing his job in representing the people, but also because he was a devout Catholic and wanted to make Catholicism the dominant religion. At the time, the main religion in Vietnam was Buddhism, so he tried repressing South Vietnamese Buddhists, and in doing this, monks protested by setting themselves on fire in Saigon Square. The Americans pressured Diem to reform, but he made no concessions. That began a series of demonstrations against the Diem government that eventually led to his assassination in 1963. And here's Sam to tell you about the U.S. involvement in the war.
U.S. involvement with the Vietnam War began in 1950, and Harry S. Truman provided aid and material to the French during the First Indochina War. Eisenhower was the first president to go headfirst into the Vietnam conflicts. He did not agree to the Geneva Accords signed by France and Vietnam in the summer of 1954. One of his foreign policies was the Domino Theory. He feared that if communism spread over to South Vietnam, it would create a domino effect, increasing communist empires would ultimately lead to all of Asia to be devoted to destroying the democratic nations in the USA. By 1961, Kennedy was in office and he had a new team to investigate conditions in South Vietnam. This investigation was known as the December 1961 White Papers. The content of this white paper was basically to plead for more aid to Vietnam. Kennedy decided to send more advisors and machinery, but would not send troops. And 3 weeks later, after Diem was killed, Kennedy was also assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson took over and he sent more military advisors to defend the South. This was a president in office when the Gulf of Tonkin attack occurred. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution happened, which is to take all necessary measures to protect American forces. In March 1965, 2 battalions of American Marines landed in Da Nang, South Vietnam. 4 months later, U.S. troops were actively involved with 180,000 troops. For the next year, 360,000, which was doubled, and with 4,000 American casualties. By 1969, the U.S. American troops increased to 540,000 troops. Johnson's hope was that the North Vietnam would get tired of the war and want peace talks, but instead the draft was instituted and anti-war movements reached an extreme. In 1968, the North Vietnam Army led a series of attacks against major cities in South Vietnam, known as the Tet Offense, to force Americans to the bargaining table. But although South Vietnam and American forces pushed the North Vietnam Army out of the cities, it was still a political loss to America and South Vietnam. Johnson left his office when time was up in disgrace. Nixon took over in 1969, claimed he had a secret plan to the war and won the election. He used a process called Vietnamization that trained the South Vietnamese troops to fight and then slowly pull American troops out of Vietnam. During Nixon's years, the war was brought into Cambodia and Laos and tried to find pockets of communism along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Finally, in January 1973, a peace treaty was signed ending the war for Americans, but not for the South Vietnam. North Vietnam took over the South after the American troops left, which led to the end of the Vietnam War 2 years later.
So how long was the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War was one of the longest wars in American history. The Vietnam War, which lasted about 10 years, starting from 1954, and it was about the longest wars that the Americans were involved in. And what were 3 reasons why the Vietnam War was so unpopular? There were 3 reasons. One was a no-win situation. Why fight a war that cannot possibly be won? The American public didn't get a lot of information about the war. All they knew was they were fighting communism. People believed the involvement was pointless and that nothing was becoming accomplished. The USA was fighting a war that cannot possibly be won, nor that the Viet Cong could not drive the USA out. The situation was not going to change if they continued. Second, dying for nothing. Many people involved in the war were fighting enemies they knew nothing about and giving their own lives at the age of 21 or younger. By the end of the war, there was a horrific number of 300,000 either dead or wounded. Lastly, the cost. A war that was fought for all the right reasons, but in all the wrong ways. Cost Americans about $30 billion in the year of 1969. The real cost of the Vietnam War, for 58,000 Americans, it cost them everything. For one, the chance to see their families again. Second, the chance to have a future, the chance to laugh or even cry. Third, to have kids or grandkids. And lastly, the chance to work at a job and experiences were all gone.
After all that went on, the US government still continued to fund the South Vietnamese army, but this funding quickly diminished. Meanwhile, as President Nixon became involved in the Watergate scandal that led to his resignation in August 1974, the North Vietnamese forces stepped up their attacks on the South and finally launched an all-out offensive in the spring of 1975. On April 30, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, fell to the North Vietnamese, who united the country under the communist rule as a Socialist Republic of Vietnam, ending the Vietnam War.